Hello everyone, I am Vanished Signal, and before we start with some new stories, like and subscribe to the channel. Also comment down below from where you are watching this. The train that never stopped. My grandfather used to tell us a story when we were kids. He was a quiet man, a railroad worker for almost 30 years, and not prone to exaggeration. But when he'd had his evening tea and the fire was low, sometimes he'd talk about the tracks that ran through the woods outside Garber's Hollow. How there was a stretch of rail that no one liked to work on after dark. He said you could hear a train coming, loud and long, shaking the ground. But it never arrived. In 1976, my grandfather was assigned to inspect that same stretch overnight after a series of minor derailments. He didn't want the job. He tried to trade shifts. When no one would take it, he packed a thermos and a flashlight and told my grandmother he'd be home by dawn. What happened that night changed him. When he returned, he quit within the week and never worked near the tracks again. He said it started around 2:30 a.m. The wind stopped, and the forest went completely silent, like something had pressed pause on the world. Then he felt it, a deep, mechanical vibration through the soil beneath his boots. A whistle echoed out in the dark, not sharp like a modern horn, but the hollow scream of a steam engine. The air stank of coal smoke, but he couldn't see a thing. Then the headlights cut through the trees. Two pale beams floating through the woods, but no engine behind them, just the lights. He stood frozen on the tracks as the whistle shrieked again. Closer this time, and a rush of wind blasted past him, hard enough to stagger him off the rails. But the train was invisible. He said he heard wheels screeching on iron, the clatter of cars flying past, the unmistakable cry of a woman sobbing from somewhere inside. He covered his ears and dropped to the gravel until the wind stopped. When he opened his eyes, everything was still. No train, no smoke. Just the stars overhead, and his own breath shaking in the cold. Years later, after he died, I went looking. I walked those same tracks at night, carrying his old flashlight. I didn't hear a train, but I did find something odd. Deep ruts in the gravel, spaced perfectly like wheels. They weren't there the next morning. Room 206. I used to work the front desk at a cheap roadside motel just outside Flagstaff, Arizona. Mostly truckers, road trippers, and the occasional couple passing through. It was boring, easy work, except for room 206. We didn't rent it out, not officially. It was on the books, listed like all the others, but we kept it marked out of order. No one ever gave me a straight answer why. My manager said the plumbing was bad. The head of maintenance said the wiring was messed up. But none of them ever actually went inside. One night, I was working alone. It was a slow Wednesday, one guest all the way down in room 112. A storm rolled in, loud, constant thunder, the kind that rattles the glass. Around 2 a.m., the line blinked on at the desk. A call from room 206. I just stared at the phone for a second. I picked up and said, "Front desk." There was no voice, only the sound of water dripping, slow, steady, and under it, like a breath, a whisper that I could barely make out. "Don't send him in." I hung up. I checked the system. Room 206 was listed as vacant. I told myself maybe it was a crossed line, old wires acting up from the lightning. I went up the stairs and walked to the room, heart pounding. The door was shut. No noise from inside. I turned the handle. It opened. The room was clean but cold. Unused, except the bathroom light was on. I stepped inside. The tub was full, almost to the brim, with ice-cold water. And in the center, perfectly upright, floated an old hotel uniform name tag. Michael. No one by that name worked there. At least, not anymore. I left the room, locked the door, and never said a word. I transferred out a month later. Every once in a while, I check the motel's website. Room 206 is still listed, still not for rent. The Watcher at Big Pine Hollow. Back in college, a few friends and I used to go hiking deep into the national forest near Big Pine Hollow. It wasn't on any popular map, just a stretch of ridgeline and dense trees out past a hunting cabin owned by my roommate's uncle. No cell service, no trails, no people. Exactly how we liked it. One trip, we stayed longer than usual. 4 days off-grid, hammocks between trees, campfire meals, that kind of thing. On the third night, we noticed something strange. The woods had gone completely silent, not just quiet, dead. No insects, no wind, no distant owls. The kind of silence that builds pressure in your ears. Then we found the first marker. It was a bundle of twigs tied with string, hung from a branch about 8 feet off the ground. Perfect knots, like a spider web woven by hand. We figured some survivalist had left it behind. But the next morning, there were more. 6 of them now, all around the camp in a perfect circle. No footprints, no trail. Nothing disturbed except those damn bundles. We took it as a message. We packed fast and started hiking back, but the forest felt wrong. We kept hearing something pacing beside us in the trees, always just out of sight. It didn't sound like an animal. It was slow, steady, and never fell behind. Even when we changed speed, when we stopped, it stopped. By the time we made it back to the dirt road, the sun was setting. We turned around one last time before piling into the truck. That's when we saw it, high up on the ridgeline, half a mile back. A tall figure, too thin to be a man, standing dead still between 2 pines, watching us. We didn't say a word, just got in and drove. Weeks later, back at school, one of my friends got curious and sent a photo he'd taken of the tree line to a professor who specialized in indigenous folklore. The man wrote back almost immediately. One line: "Do not go back there." The deer that wasn't my uncle lives in the outskirts of Maine, in a cabin tucked between 2 hills and a marsh that freezes thick in the winter. He's not a storyteller. He's a hunter, and a quiet one. But one night over dinner, after a couple drinks, he told me something I've never been able to shake. It happened the year his dog Daisy went missing. He was out in the woods, following fresh snow prints, when he saw a white-tailed deer standing perfectly still in the clearing ahead. He lined up his rifle but stopped. The deer was wrong. It wasn't the size. It was normal. It was the face. Something about the way it looked back at him felt off. Too still. Too focused. Like it was looking into him, not at him. And its legs were all wrong. The joints were too high, too long, like stilts wearing skin. He lowered the rifle. The deer didn't move. He stepped back. That's when it smiled. A human smile. Wide, flat, and slow, like it had to work to remember how to do it. He dropped his gun and ran all the way back to the cabin. Daisy never came home. But every now and then, around the first snow of the year, he hears something tapping on the window at night. Just once. And in the morning, he finds deer tracks leading from the tree line straight to the porch, and none going back. Room below the library. I was interning at a small university in upstate New York, helping catalog archival books in the library basement. There were rumors the place was haunted, but I didn't buy any of it. The only creepy thing about the building was the way the lights flickered every time the elevator moved. One night, I stayed late. It was finals week, and I was alone in the basement organizing some old theology texts. Around 11 p.m., I noticed a draft. Cold air, like a window had blown open, but there weren't any windows down there. Then I saw it, a door that wasn't there before. set into the wall behind a loose bookshelf, partially hidden. Old iron hinges, no knob, but it was open just a crack. I don't know what made me do it, but I pulled the door wide and stepped inside. There was a stone staircase going down, not part of the library plans. It wasn't even the same architecture. I only took 3 steps before I heard it. A whispering chorus, dozens of voices speaking in unison from below. The only word I could make out was my name. I turned and ran. The next morning, I tried to show my supervisor. The door was gone, wall patched clean, no sign it had ever been there. But I still feel the cold sometimes when I walk past that section of the basement, like something breathing beneath the concrete. The man on the roof, when I was 14, I stayed a week at my cousin's house during summer break. He lived out in rural Kentucky, the kind of place where the closest neighbor is a cornfield, and the second closest is a mile down the road. His family had this old, lopsided farmhouse that creaked like it was still settling into the land after 100 years. But it wasn't the house that got to me. It was what happened on the 4th night. It started simple. I woke up to the sound of footsteps on the roof. Not squirrels or raccoons, actual boots. Heavy and deliberate, pacing from one end of the house to the other. At first, I thought it had to be my cousin messing with me. But when I got up and looked out the window, I could see him asleep on the couch, the TV still casting flickering shadows across the room. The steps kept going for another 10 minutes. Then silence. Next morning, I mentioned it to his parents. They looked at each other, but didn't say much. That evening, I noticed something strange while walking the dog in the yard. The only way onto the roof was from the second-floor balcony, rotted through and barely holding up a rusted-out gutter. No ladders, no overhanging branches, and nothing left behind. No prints, no tools, no joke. That night, I heard the footsteps again, but this time they didn't stay on the roof. They came down the outer wall. I swear I heard fingernails scraping the siding, slow and steady, until it reached the window. Mine. There was a tap, not a knock, not a bang, just a quiet, single tap. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. I just stared at the ceiling until morning came and the light chased whatever it was away. Years later, my cousin told me his parents had sold the house after they found dead birds on the roof. Dozens of them, arranged in perfect spirals. Nothing else was ever explained. The lantern in the fog. I was hiking alone in the Pacific Northwest, chasing some solitude after a rough breakup. The trails were empty and fog had rolled in heavy, cloaking the pines in a thick, smoky gray. I'd set up camp near a small creek and planned to hike up to the summit the next day. That evening, I saw it for the first time. A single lantern bobbing through the mist. It was faint, probably a quarter mile off. Just a dull orange glow swaying back and forth. At first, I figured it was another hiker trying to find their way. But something felt off. There was no sound, no crunch of footsteps, no snapping twigs. Just the glow, floating too smoothly, like it wasn't attached to a person at all. I watched it for 10 minutes before it blinked out, like someone had pinched the flame with bare fingers. Then the woods fell quiet. Next night, the lantern came closer. Same soft sway, same eerie silence. I called out. Nothing. Just that light, floating like a signal I couldn't read. This time, it circled my camp, slow and wide. I didn't sleep. On the 3rd night, it was at the edge of my camp, just 20 feet away, burning low like a dying candle. And that's when I saw the figure behind it. Tall, thin, face completely covered by a curtain of long, wet hair. It wasn't holding the lantern, it was hovering in front of it. I tore down my camp in minutes and hiked overnight down the mountain. I don't know who or what it was, but some lights aren't meant to be followed. The cellar door, growing up, my grandparents had a farmhouse in Virginia. Classic two-story place with a storm cellar in the backyard. Concrete stairs, metal doors with rusted handles, and a padlock to keep the critters out. It always gave me the creeps, even in daylight. One summer, I was staying there for a week. On the second night, I woke up around 3 a.m. to the sound of the cellar doors slamming shut. I peeked out the window and saw nothing. No wind, no raccoons, nothing that could have made that noise. But the sound repeated every night after that. Always at the same time, always just once. On the fourth night, I snuck out with a flashlight and crept across the yard. I could see the padlock still in place, hanging off the latch. But the doors were slightly ajar, like something was pushing from inside. I got close enough to see the edge of the steps, and I swear I heard breathing. Slow, wet breaths. Then something scraped the door from the inside, right at eye level. 3 sharp taps. I ran back to the house and never went near that cellar again. My grandfather sealed it off with cement a year before he passed. I never asked why. The thing in the outhouse. My great-aunt and uncle had a cabin up in the mountains of Montana. No electricity, no plumbing, just a wood stove, a pump for water, and an outhouse 50 yards from the cabin. It was quiet out there, almost too quiet. The kind of quiet that makes you listen harder, like your ears are waiting for something to break it. I stayed there with my younger brother for a week in late September. The air was starting to turn cold at night, and that outhouse was the worst part of the stay. Especially at 2 a.m., when nature calls and you've got no choice but to make that chilly walk with a flashlight and hope you don't meet a bear. On the third night, my brother came back from using it and said something weird. He swore there was someone breathing in the dark corner of the outhouse. He couldn't see anything, but he could feel it. This presence. Warm and sour smelling, like old milk and copper. I told him he was being dramatic, probably spooked by a raccoon or just the smell. But the next night, it was my turn. I brought the flashlight, opened the door, and right away, I felt that wrongness. The kind of gut-pulling, spine-stiffening dread that makes your mouth go dry. I stood there in the doorway, scanning the inside, and for a second, everything looked normal. Then the flashlight flickered, just once. In that flicker, something was crouched in the corner, its back hunched, hands flat on the floor, face turned toward me. I only saw it for a heartbeat. Long arms, pale skin, black, empty eyes. Then the light came back, and the corner was empty again. I slammed the door and ran back to the cabin. We didn't use the outhouse again that trip. The reflection that wasn't me. This happened to me in college. I was living in a cheap apartment just off campus. It was one of those old buildings with warped windows and paper-thin walls. But the rent was cheap, and I didn't complain. Except for the bathroom mirror. It was an antique thing, set in a heavy wooden frame, and it had a weird distortion to it, like the glass wasn't flat. I'd catch little warps in my reflection if I moved too fast, like my face was trailing behind me by a split second. At first, I figured it was old glass, nothing more. Then one night, I caught my reflection blinking when I wasn't. I stood there, brushing my teeth, and I swear, my head didn't move, my body didn't shift, but my reflection blinked. Slowly, intentionally. I stopped brushing, stared. Nothing happened. Thought maybe I imagined it. The next night, it was worse. I turned to leave the bathroom, and in the corner of my eye, I saw my reflection still facing the mirror. I turned back immediately. Everything looked normal again. From then on, I kept a towel over the mirror, every single night. One night I forgot. Woke up to a sound like nails tapping glass. I stepped into the hallway and the bathroom light was on. The mirror was uncovered. And there was someone standing in front of it. Someone my height, my shape, but facing away from the mirror. I could see its back in the reflection. Its real back was facing me, shoulders hunched like it was about to turn. I shut the bathroom door and didn't open it again until sunrise. That week, I paid a guy from Craigslist to rip the mirror out. He didn't even ask why. The screamer in the caves. My cousin and I were exploring a network of abandoned mining caves in Arizona. We'd heard about them from some offhand comment at a local gas station. Apparently, they were sealed in the 80s, but still accessible if you knew where to look. So, of course, being stupid 20-somethings with nothing better to do, we brought headlamps, gloves, and bad instincts. The tunnels started narrow, but eventually opened into bigger chambers. We walked for nearly 2 hours into the darkness, leaving a trail of glow sticks to mark our way back. At one point, we found a shaft that dropped straight down into the rock. Rotted wooden beams lined the edge, half collapsed. That's when we heard the scream. It came from the shaft. Low at first, almost like wind. But it grew into something human. And then, inhuman. A warbling, gasping sound, as if someone were screaming underwater. We froze. My cousin whispered, "Did you hear that?" Then it screamed again, louder, angrier, and closer. I don't know what made us run, but we ran. Didn't stop for breath, didn't look back, just followed our glow sticks and hoped to hell we didn't miss a turn. We reached daylight gasping, clothes ripped, hands bleeding. The sound never followed us out. But when we returned a week later with another friend, all the glow sticks were gone. The woman under the bridge. I used to fish a lot as a teenager. There was a bridge about 40 minutes outside of town, off a winding back road where people rarely drove unless they were lost. It crossed a narrow river and had no lights or shoulder, just a weather-worn guardrail and a steep path leading down to the water. I liked it because it was quiet, peaceful. Until one night it wasn't. It was just after midnight, and I had my lantern set up on the rocks while I waited for a bite. The night was still, the water slow. Then I heard someone crying, a soft, stifled sobbing, someone trying to keep it in. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but it got louder, more frantic. It sounded like it was coming from beneath the bridge. I got up and moved quietly toward the support beams. That's when I saw her. A woman crouched on the stone embankment, her back to me, hair matted and black and dripping into the water. She was shaking like she was cold, whispering something I couldn't make out. I called to her. She stopped moving. I took one more step and my lantern caught her face, except it wasn't a face, just skin. No eyes, no mouth, no nose. Just a blank, pale canvas. She screamed, but not from her face. The scream came from everywhere, all at once, like it was inside my skull. I dropped the lantern and ran. Never fished there again. The cradle in the woods. There's an old stretch of forest in Maine my grandfather warned me never to hike through alone. He was a logger and swore the place was cursed. Said he once saw a man walk in and never walk back out. I didn't believe him, of course. Thought he was being dramatic, until I did it anyway. I was hiking solo with my dog, a big shepherd mix, when we wandered into that stretch. The trees were thick, the air was still. Everything felt wrong. The forest was too quiet. No birds, no wind, just the sound of leaves crunching under my boots. After an hour, I found something. It was a wooden cradle, just sitting there in a perfectly round clearing, like it had been placed down gently, moss-covered, old, but intact. No house nearby, no trail markers, just that cradle, swaying slightly like someone had just walked away from it. My dog started whining, ears flat. Then he bolted, ran so fast I could barely keep up. When I finally caught up to him, we were out of the forest. I looked back. The clearing was gone. No cradle, no opening, just more trees. The long corridor. My brother used to work security at a hospital that was in the middle of being torn down. It was one of those old-world facilities with brick walls and miles of underground tunnels, most of which had been sealed or forgotten. His job was mostly just walking the empty halls at night to keep out vandals or kids sneaking in to ghost hunt. One night, he took a wrong turn and ended up in a corridor he didn't recognize. It was long, dimly lit, fluorescence flickering every few feet. But what stood out was the silence. Hospitals always have some kind of noise, machines humming, pipes creaking. But this place was dead quiet. He walked down it, thinking it would loop back. Halfway down, he saw a door open slowly on its own. Just creaked open like it was welcoming him. Against his better judgment, he stepped inside. The room was empty, but the lights didn't work. He turned on his flashlight and saw scratch marks on the walls. Deep grooves, like someone had raked metal claws across the concrete. No furniture, no equipment. Just a pile of rusted medical tools on the floor, still wet with something thick and dark. He turned around to leave, but the door had shut behind him, and it wouldn't open. He banged and yelled, and finally it gave way. But the hallway wasn't the same. The tiles were different. The lights were all off. And at the far end was a figure standing perfectly still, facing away, not moving. My brother didn't wait. He ran. Took a week off after that. Said the hospital wasn't empty anymore. The clock at Camp Wendigo, I was hired as a seasonal counselor at a small summer camp in northern Michigan. Camp Wendigo. The name was already ominous, but the place itself seemed fine at first. Rustic cabins, canoes, fire pits, your classic camp setup. My assigned cabin was the furthest one out from the main lodge, which meant more privacy and more silence at night. The first strange thing I noticed was the clock. An old grandfather clock in the corner of the lodge. It didn't work. Hands frozen at 3:17. It didn't tick, didn't chime, just sat there like a prop. But every morning at breakfast, it would be ticking again. Hands always at a different time. I assumed someone was fixing it, until I asked. The camp director went pale and told me they had no key for it and no idea who had brought it into the lodge in the first place. One night, after lights out, I went to the kitchen to grab a snack and heard a chime. Loud, metallic. It was the clock, striking 3:17. I hadn't even known it could chime. The sound rang through the lodge like a church bell. Then it stopped. I stepped into the main room, and the clock's hands were spinning fast, like they were being wound by an invisible force. A door behind the clock creaked open. I never noticed it was a door at all. Beyond it was a narrow, sloping staircase, leading down into what should have been the crawl space. I don't know what made me step forward, but I did, just far enough to see what was down there. The stairs led to a room. In the middle of the room stood another grandfather clock, exactly the same as the one upstairs. Its hands read 3:17. The chime rang again, deafening in the tight space. I ran. I didn't sleep that night, and when I asked about the basement the next morning, no one believed me. Said there was no stairwell behind the clock. I looked. There wasn't. It was just solid wood paneling. It was the phone in the woods. It was supposed to be a disconnected line. My cousin and I were hiking on his family's private land when we found an old emergency call box deep in the forest. You know the kind. Red metal casing, big black receiver, a button to call for help. There hadn't been any infrastructure out there in decades. The pole it was attached to was rusted. The cord was frayed. The phone itself had vines growing over it. But the second I touched it, it started ringing. I froze, looked at my cousin. He just shrugged. Against every better instinct, I picked it up. On the other end, a woman's voice whispered, "Please don't hang up." "He's watching me." I asked who she was, but the line went dead. Then the dial tone turned into a loud, static hiss. And in that hiss, I heard breathing, slow, steady, right into my ear. I dropped the phone and stepped back. My cousin tried to laugh it off, said it was probably a prank, maybe from a radio tower somewhere nearby. But he looked shaken too. We went back the next day with my uncle. The phone was gone. Just a hole in the ground and a metal post with no wiring. We searched the area, but there was no trace of the red call box. It was like it had never been there. The man with the lantern. My grandmother's property bordered a state forest, and as kids, we were always warned not to go too deep after dark. "The man with the lantern will get you," she'd say. We thought it was a joke, just some old tale to keep us in line, until I saw him. I was 16, home for the summer, and taking a late walk with my little brother. We had flashlights, but mine started flickering about a mile in. We were near an old deer trail when my brother stopped and whispered, "Do you see that?" Through the trees, a warm, yellow light bobbed slowly. It looked like someone carrying a lantern, swaying gently, like they were walking deliberately, not in a rush. But something was wrong. The light didn't cast shadows, and the figure holding it had no shape, just darkness. As it stepped closer, the light didn't get any brighter. If anything, it dimmed. I told my brother to run. We made it back to the property line, and just before we crossed into the field behind my grandmother's house, I looked back. The light was gone. But a few weeks later, I heard someone knocking on the back door. It was past midnight. I looked through the kitchen window and saw the lantern, glowing faintly on the other side of the screen door. No footsteps, no voice. Just a knock, then silence. I never opened the door and never saw him again. But I still won't go near those woods after dark. The bleeding room. During my last year in college, I moved into a cheap off-campus apartment. The rent was suspiciously low, but I didn't ask too many questions. I needed a place fast, and it was a private unit above a garage with its own entry and no shared walls. Perfect. The first night I spent there, I woke up around 3 a.m. to a slow, rhythmic tapping. At first, I thought it was rain. Then I realized it wasn't hitting the window. It was coming from the wall above my bed. I tapped back, just to see. The noise stopped immediately. The next day, I noticed a long, thin crack running across the ceiling. It hadn't been there when I moved in. I assumed it was old water damage and ignored it until that night, when I was woken again. This time not by tapping, but by something wet. My sheets were soaked. I turned on the lamp and saw a red streak dripping down from the crack in the ceiling. I freaked out and grabbed my phone, called my landlord, and he actually came over right away. But by the time he arrived, the ceiling was dry. No crack, no stain. The sheets were clean. I could tell he thought I was high or having a breakdown. But I knew what I'd seen. Things escalated. Every night, around the same time, the tapping would start. Then the bleeding, always from a slightly different spot. I tried recording it, but nothing ever showed up in the footage. I called a friend to stay over one weekend to prove I wasn't crazy. We both woke up to the smell of iron, and her nose started bleeding the second she sat up. She left in the morning and never came back. The worst part happened on my final night there. I'd already decided to leave and was packing up late. The ceiling crack had returned, but this time it stretched from one side of the room to the other. As I watched, a single drop of red liquid fell from the center. Then another. Then it split open like a wound, literally tore open. And I saw something underneath. Eyes, not human eyes. Deep, bulbous things with no lids, watching me from beneath the plaster like they'd been trapped in the house for years. I ran, left everything, never went back. I didn't even break my lease. I don't care if it was haunted or if I hallucinated everything. What I saw wasn't meant for this world. The Black Pond. When I was a kid, there was this little stretch of forest behind our house that everyone just called the Old Trails. Nothing special. Just footpaths, mossy rocks, broken logs. But at the farthest end, where the trail narrowed into brush, there was a pond. Dark, still, completely silent. No frogs, no birds. Nothing ever rippled the water, not even the wind. We called it the Black Pond. No one swam in it. One summer, my friend Micah dared me to throw a rock into the center. We'd both heard the stories, that if you disturbed the pond, something would follow you home. But we were 11 and stupid. So I picked up a big one and lobbed it in. It didn't splash. It just sank, soundless, like the water was syrup. And then, from the middle, we saw bubbles rise, one after another, then a ring of tiny ripples, slowly moving outward like something massive had stirred underneath. We ran. But that night, Micah didn't come home. Search parties were called, and they scoured the woods for days. They found his bike and his backpack near the pond, but no trace of him. The pond was drained. Nothing, not even fish. Just thick, black mud. Years later, I returned home and walked those trails again. I stopped by the Black Pond, now refilled by rain and time. Still silent, still unmoving. I looked into it and saw something looking back. Not a reflection. A shape, just beneath the surface. Same height, same hair. It looked like Micah, and it was smiling. The pale ones, so when I was 19, I took a summer job working as a fire lookout in Montana. It was isolated, exactly what I needed after a long, bitter breakup. The tower was 30 miles from the nearest town and accessible only by a single winding road that snaked up into the mountains. Supplies were dropped off once a week. Other than radio check-ins, I was alone. The first few weeks were uneventful. I'd wake at dawn, scan the tree lines for smoke, note wind patterns, and spend the rest of the day reading or sketching. I grew to love the stillness, the sense of being completely detached from the world. Then one night, I woke up to static on the radio. It wasn't the normal interference I was used to. It was loud, harsh, and came in strange bursts. I tried to tune it out, but then a voice cut through. It was whispering, slow and wet, like someone was speaking through a mouth full of water. I couldn't understand it, but it kept repeating something in a low, guttural tone. I turned the radio off, thinking it was some weird signal bounce. The next night, I woke again. Not from the radio this time, but from the sound of footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, circling the base of the tower. I froze. There was no vehicle nearby. No sounds of approach, just footsteps in the dirt and a faint rustling, like something was brushing against the walls. I stayed quiet, barely breathing, until they stopped. By morning, there were prints in the dirt. Long, narrow feet with far too many toes. The forest around me changed after that. Birds stopped chirping. Even the wind sounded muffled. I'd catch glimpses of figures between the trees, thin, pale bodies with joints that bent the wrong way. Their skin looked raw, stretched too tightly over bones. They never came close during the day, but at night they got bolder. I could hear them climbing the steps, stopping just outside the door. I tried radioing for help. Static. I tried my phone. No signal. I was stuck. And every night, they came closer. The last night I stayed there, I woke to find the trap door at the top of the stairs open just an inch, swaying back and forth. That was it. I packed what I could and ran. Drove down that narrow road without stopping. When I reached town, I told the ranger station something broke in. They dismissed it. Said raccoons. Said maybe I was just spooked by the isolation. But I've never forgotten the sound of those steps or the way the air felt, like the forest was holding its breath. I've never been back. The woman in the stump. When I was 6, I had a recurring dream about a woman who lived inside a tree stump behind our house. She had long black hair that covered her face and wore a dress made of bark and moss. In the dream, she'd whisper to me through the bedroom window, asking me to let her in. I always said no. One night, I woke up and saw her outside the real window, not in a dream. She didn't speak this time, just stared. I screamed, and my mom rushed in. When I told her what I saw, she got pale. Not scared, sad. That morning, she took me out back to the stump. I'd never actually gone that far into the woods. It looked normal, rotting, hollow. She knelt beside it and whispered something I couldn't hear. Later that week, we moved. Years passed. I forgot about her. Then 2 years ago, after my mom passed, I found her old journal. In it were dozens of entries about dreams she'd had as a child, about a woman in a tree stump who called to her. Same description, same voice. She wrote that she thought she'd broken the cycle, but it came back with me. And in the last page, there was a line I'll never forget. If she calls to you, never answer. If you do, she can walk again. I've moved since then, several times. And each time, no matter where I go, I find a stump nearby. And sometimes, in the early hours before dawn, I hear something soft at the window. A voice asking to be let in. The faces in the window. When I was a teenager, my family had this tradition every fall, renting a cabin deep in the Adirondacks for a week. My parents claimed it was their way of disconnecting, of resetting before the holidays. To me, it was just an excuse to skip a week of school and stay up late reading. The cabin was old and creaky, nestled in a hollow and surrounded by thick trees. It had a chimney that never worked right and floors that popped and cracked under the lightest step. Still, it was cozy in that worn, familiar way old places sometimes are. The odd thing about the cabin, though, was the living room window. It was enormous, stretched nearly from the wooden floorboards to the slanted ceiling beams. It faced out toward the forest, offering a sweeping view of trees that went on for miles. During the day, the window let in golden light, and you could see birds and deer pass through. At night, it was something else entirely, just a wide, black void. With no outdoor lighting and no close neighbors, the forest became a shapeless, dense curtain. The window turned into a mirror after dark, reflecting the flicker of our fireplace and our own faces staring back at us. It started on the second night. I woke up sometime around 2 a.m. I wasn't scared or anything. I was just thirsty. The bathroom was tiny and connected to the kitchen, so I padded down the hallway, careful not to wake anyone. As I passed the living room, I glanced at the window. That's when I saw them. Dozens of faces, pressed right up against the glass. They weren't clear, like someone you'd recognize. They were pale, barely illuminated, but their features were warped, Eyes too wide, mouths either open too far or too tight. They weren't moving, just watching, frozen. I stopped dead. My brain tried to make sense of it. Was it fog? Light from the moon creating illusions. Was I dreaming? But as I stood there staring, I swear I saw one of the faces blink. Just one, but that was enough. I turned around, walked straight back to bed, and pulled the covers over my head like I was 6 years old. The next morning, I didn't tell anyone. It sounded too crazy. I mean, I had just woken up. It had to be a dream, right? That afternoon, my little brother Sam announced he wanted to sleep in the living room. He loved that big window. Said he wanted to fall asleep under the stars, even if you couldn't see many through the trees. My parents shrugged, set him up with a sleeping bag, and left a flashlight next to him. I didn't say anything. I should have. At 3:07 a.m., he screamed. A horrible, breathless scream that yanked me out of a dead sleep. We all bolted down the hallway to find him standing in the center of the room, pale as snow, tears streaming down his face. He kept pointing at the window, unable to speak. It was pitch black outside, nothing visible but our own reflections. My dad turned on the porch light and ran outside with a flashlight, thinking there were trespassers. He found nothing. No prints in the dirt, no movement in the woods, not even a snapped twig. Sam just kept saying the same thing over and over. They were watching me. After that, no one went near the window at night. We kept the curtains drawn tight and huddled around the fire like something out of a storybook. I didn't sleep much the rest of the trip. But on our last morning, something made me look. Everyone else was packing. I stood there at the window, the curtain drawn halfway, and I leaned in. The glass was covered in small handprints. They weren't smudged like greasy fingers. They were perfectly outlined, as though something had deliberately pressed them in the condensation. Maybe 24, all child-sized. When I told my parents, my dad insisted it must have been raccoons. Maybe they climbed up and pawed at the window. But I knew better. Raccoons don't have fingers that long. They don't press their faces to the glass. They don't watch you while you sleep. We never rented that cabin again. A few years later, I tried to look it up online. I found a listing. The same cozy place, the same creaky beams and cracked chimney. But in every photo, the living room was shown from behind. The fireplace, the furniture, the bookshelves. Not one photo of the window, not one. It's like they know. The woman beneath the bridge. There's an old concrete bridge on the outskirts of the town I grew up in. It crosses over a narrow, slow-moving creek that winds through the woods like a vein. The locals all know it. But nobody really talks about it anymore. Unless you bring it up first. And if you do, someone always ends the conversation with a warning. Don't stop on the bridge at night. The story goes back decades. Supposedly, in the 1940s, a woman went missing from a nearby farmhouse. Her husband reported her gone one morning, claiming she'd vanished in the night. A search party was sent out. They found her nightgown snagged on a low-hanging tree limb by the creek, a few strands of long black hair clinging to the bark. But no body, no signs of struggle, just the slow water and the shadow of the bridge. Years passed. Nothing was ever found. Locals whispered that she'd drowned herself, taken by grief or madness. Others said her husband had done something to her and dumped her in the woods. But the most unsettling part, there wasn't the mystery of her death. It was what started happening after. People began hearing things at night when crossing that bridge. Whispers, a woman crying softly. Then, people claimed they saw her. Not her face exactly, but a figure. pale, hair dripping, just standing in the creek beneath the bridge, always just standing, sometimes facing the water, sometimes looking straight up at the driver. The sightings came from everyone: teenagers, delivery drivers, school teachers, anyone who drove that road alone after midnight. When I was 22, I came back home after college. I had just broken up with someone and was feeling hollow, restless. One night, after driving around aimlessly to clear my head, I found myself heading toward that part of town. The air was foggy, cool, the kind of night that makes the street lights glow in long halos. I didn't mean to go to the bridge, but when I realized where I was, I didn't stop. I figured it was all just a story anyway. Something to keep kids from wandering around alone at night. As I neared the crossing, my headlights lit up the guardrails, the moss growing along the cracks in the pavement. The water below was calm, and then, halfway across, my engine stalled. No warning, no flickering dashboard, just dead. The headlights shut off. The music stopped. Even my phone in the passenger seat glitched out, screen frozen and black. I sat there for a second, heart hammering. Tried the ignition. Nothing. And then I heard it. Crying. Not loud, not dramatic. Just quiet sobs, like someone trying not to be heard but unable to hold it in. I froze. I didn't look out the window. I didn't check the rearview mirror. I just stared ahead, holding my breath, listening. The crying grew louder, closer, like someone was just outside the driver's side door. I reached for my phone, screen still dark. And then, slowly, like ice forming across a lake, the windows began to fog. Not from the inside, from the outside. Every window at once. And on the driver's side, a handprint. Long fingers, too long, pressed lightly against the glass. It didn't slam. It didn't scrape. Just rested there like she was leaning in to see me better. I don't remember how long I sat there. Eventually, the lights flicked back on. My car started. The radio returned to life mid-song, and the fog on the windows faded as fast as it came. I never told anyone, not for years. But I still won't drive that road at night. And if you ever do, don't stop on the bridge.